On the morning of July 25th, 1944, the sky over the French town of Saint-Lô turned a bruised metallic grey. The year was 1944. More than 1,500 heavy bombers arrived in a formation that seemed to stretch toward the horizon. This was the culmination of weeks of mounting frustration. But for the men waiting on the ground, it felt like the end of the world. Private Outlaw was one of those men, crouched in a shallow foxhole and pressing his hands over his ears, with enough force to bruise his own skin. He was not looking at the German lines, but instead at the dirt between his heavy boots. As the first wave of ordnance left the bomb bays, the ground did not just shake. It began to vibrate with a frequency that made the earth feel like a liquid. This was the tragedy of the short bombing, where 5,000 tons of high explosives and white phosphorus fell directly onto the American infantry positions. When the smoke finally cleared, the landscape was unrecognizable. Hedgerows that had stood for centuries were pulverized into grey dust. Soldiers emerged from the earth in a state of absolute stupor, their ears bleeding and their uniforms coated in a fine powder. Yet, as dazed as they were, they looked toward a German line that had quite literally ceased to exist. This was a high-stakes gamble intended to solve a single suffocating problem. General J. Lawton Collins was willing to risk his own men under the belly of his own air force because he saw no other way out of the stalemate. It leads us to the question that defined that entire summer. How did the Americans break the trap of the Normandy hedgerows? To find the answer, we have to look at the Norman bocage. These were not the manicured hedges of an English garden, but ancient earthen embankments topped with tangled root systems and hawthorn. For the American First Army, this terrain was a tactical nightmare, where every field became a natural fortress. A single German machine gun crew could hold up an entire battalion for a day. It was a slow, attritional grind where progress was measured in yards and paid for in lives. General Collins realized that the American army was being bled white in a landscape that neutralized their greatest advantages. In the hedgerows, a tank was a liability because its thin underbelly was exposed every time it climbed an embankment. On the other side of the line, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge was struggling to manage a defense that was brittle but stubborn. Von Kluge knew that as long as the Americans were tangled in the brush, the German 7th Army could hold. He was playing for time, hoping for a miracle, while his soldiers used the sunken roads to turn every field into a killing zone. By mid-July, the stalemate was absolute. An entire division could suffer 3,000 casualties just to move the front line half a mile. The psychological weight of this created a blank, vibrating exhaustion in men who had spent weeks staring at a wall of green. They were waiting for the muzzle flash that would end their war. Collins decided that the only way out was to stop trying to maneuver through the trap and simply blow a hole in it. He wanted a corridor of passage 3 miles wide to force a systemic collapse. But to understand how the First Army ended up in this cratered hell, we must look back to the first days after the beachheads were won. The victory at the water's edge had been total, but the ground beyond the sand was a cage. To understand how the armor was failing, you have to look at the belly of a tank. For weeks, the Sherman had been the pride of the force, but in the bocage it was behaving like a clumsy animal. When a tank reached one of those ancient embankments, the nose would pitch toward the sky as it climbed. For those few seconds, the thin steel plate on the underside was tilted up and exposed. To a German teenager hiding in the brush with a rocket launcher, that steel belly was the biggest target in France. The tactical manual said tanks were supposed to provide the breakthrough, but here they were being picked off one by one. This was the hedgerow habit, a state of paralysis where armor stayed on the roads and infantry stayed in the ditches. The solution did not come from a laboratory in Detroit, but from the repair depots. Sergeant Kulin was one of the men tasked with keeping these broken machines running. He was shielding his eyes from the sparks of an arc welder as he tried to solve the problem with a pile of scrap metal. He was looking at the jagged steel beams the Germans had planted on the beaches to stop landing craft. Kulin realized that if you could not go over the hedge, you had to go through it. He began welding these scrap beams into 4-pronged teeth and fusing them directly onto the nose of a tank. The Invention bit into the earth and allowed the engine to soar through the roots. The machine emerged on the other side with its guns forward. A simple piece of scrap changed everything. While the armor was finding its teeth, the infantry was still being choked by a rigid way of thinking. In the marshes of the Taute River, the water table was so high that a foxhole became a well in 20 minutes. The German defenders had turned the terrain into a billiard table with clear lines of sight across the mud. An American infantry division was ordered to take a cluster of farm buildings, but they attempted a series of frontal daylight assaults across open ground. It was a disaster that cost 800 casualties in a single operation. The old rules of war were failing. The psychological snap was immediate. This was not a heroic stand, but a total collapse. At Saint-Germain, the officers watched in horror as their men began an unauthorized hegira, drifting away from the firing line under the pretense of helping the wounded. In one field, a group of soldiers simply stopped fighting and began waving white handkerchiefs toward the German lines. They were not cowards. They were simply men who had realized that the rigid tactics they were being ordered to use were a death sentence. This failure at La Yard proved that army-style planning was being shredded by the reality of the Norman dirt. The infantry was learning that in the hedgerows there was no such thing as a front line. There were only hundreds of individual isolated battles happening in small green squares. But while the men in the dirt looked for ways to survive, the man in the command tent was looking for a way to win. General J. Lawton Collins realized that neither the scrap metal teeth of the tanks nor the bravery of the infantry would be enough to break the stalemate alone. He stopped thinking about the hedgerows as obstacles to be climbed and started seeing them as a cage that needed to be shattered from above. He began to look at his maps for the exact point where he could apply enough pressure to make the entire system burst. To understand the shift that was about to happen, you have to picture a single room in a French farmhouse. While the infantry was dying in the mud of the Taute River, Collins sat alone under the light of a single lamp. He was looking at a map of a road near a town called Marigny. He was done with the sluggers match and the slow, agonizing crawl through every green square of the bocage. The strategy up to this point had been a grinding diversion. The British were tied down at Caen, drawing the bulk of the German armor toward them in a costly battle of attrition. It was a pattern of action designed to keep the enemy off balance, but it was not a breakthrough. High command was full of talk about massive amphibious landings or grand airborne drops behind the lines. Collins looked at those plans and rejected them. He did not want a new front, but a way to shatter the one he already had. His plan, Operation Cobra, was a bet on a single narrow point of penetration. Instead of attacking across a broad front, he decided to concentrate his entire force on a strip of land only 7,000 yards wide. He was taking the power of 3 infantry divisions and 2 heavy armored divisions and trying to squeeze them through a gap no wider than a few miles. To make it work, he needed the Air Force to act as his heavy artillery. The air chiefs wanted to fly their bombers parallel to the front lines to avoid hitting their own men. Collins stood over the maps and insisted they fly perpendicular, using the long straight line of the Perrières-Saint-Lô highway as a visual guide. He knew that if the planes flew parallel, the bomb dump would be too wide and too thin. He wanted a concentrated carpet of fire that would turn a 6-square-mile target into a landscape of the moon. He was asking for 5,000 tons of explosives to fall just 1,400 yards in front of his own men. But there was a technical problem that no amount of high-level planning could solve. In 1944, the men in the tanks could not talk to the men in the planes. They were operating on entirely different radio frequencies. To the pilots in the sky, a tank in a hedgerow was just a green shape that might be friendly or might be an enemy. This led to a technical experiment that would change the nature of armored warfare. Lieutenant Gates was one of the men tasked with bridging this gap. He was in the cramped, oily interior of a lead tank, working with a technician to install a bulky aircraft radio. These were high-frequency sets taken directly from 9th Air Force stock and were never intended to survive the vibration of a tank engine. Lieutenant Gates was white-knuckling a handset, trying to talk a fighter-bomber pilot down through the haze of smoke and dust. He was describing what he saw through his periscope, like a hidden anti-tank gun in the corner of an orchard or a Panther tank waiting behind a stone wall. For the first time, the eyes in the sky were directly connected to the teeth on the ground. The air and the ground were finally speaking the same language. By the time the operation was ready to launch, 40% of all daily sorties were allocated to this direct ground support. The pilots were no longer just bombing a map, but were protecting specific columns of men. The logistics supporting this massive concentration of force were equally staggering. In the 25 days leading up to the strike, nearly 500,000 tons of supplies were moved into the sector. Collins had allocated 140,000 rounds of artillery for just the first 5 days. He was building a machine designed to obliterate a defensive system that had been impenetrable for weeks. By July 24th, The trap was set. The tanks had their steel teeth, the pilots had their radios, and the infantry had been pulled back to create a safety buffer. The men waited in the assembly areas, painting fresh White Star insignia on their vehicles to help the pilots distinguish friend from foe. Everyone knew that if this gamble failed, there was no backup plan. But as the first waves of bombers appeared on the horizon, the weather began to turn. The morning of July 24, 1944, was supposed to be the end of the stalemate. Nearly 2,000 heavy bombers were in the air, a massive wall of silver moving toward a narrow strip of French soil. But as the lead pilots approached the target, a thick layer of clouds rolled in and obscured the Perrières-Saint-Lô highway. At 09:15, the order went out to postpone the operation. The command was sent to the airfields and the orbiting wings to recall the planes and not to drop. For most of the fleet, the message arrived in time. They turned their heavy noses back toward England, with their bomb bays still full. But in the chaos of a 2,000-plane formation, the word did not reach everyone. Some pilots, seeing a momentary gap in the clouds, began their runs. To understand the disaster that followed, you have to look at the geometry of the bomb run. The air commanders had chosen to fly perpendicular to the front lines, rather than parallel. They believed this would get the planes over the target faster, but it meant that if a bombardier released his load just a fraction of a second early, the bombs would not fall on the enemy. They would fall on the American men waiting to attack. Private Hendricks was huddling at the bottom of a muddy crater, his back pressed against the cold earth. He had been told to pull back 1,200 yards from the German lines to create a safety buffer. He was waiting for the sound of the explosions in the German trenches. What he heard instead was a heavy thudding that seemed to be moving toward him. This was the creeping barrage of a short bombing. He watched in terror as the explosions walked across the fields, pulverizing the hedgerows and closing the distance to his own hole. When the dust settled, the 30th Infantry Division, known as Old Hickory, was in a state of shock. 25 men were dead, and another 131 were wounded. The strike had not hit the German panzers. It had hit the very men who were supposed to exploit the gap. Inside the command tent that afternoon, the air generals were horrified. They looked at the casualty reports and saw a fundamental flaw in the plan. They demanded that for the next attempt, the infantry be pulled back at least 3,000 yards. They wanted a massive safety zone, a buffer of nearly 2 miles, to ensure that no more short bombs would kill their own troops. But General Collins refused to budge. To understand why this decision mattered, you have to look at the map from the perspective of a German sergeant in a foxhole. The German troops were masters of the recovery. If the American infantry pulled back 2 miles, it would take them hours to reach the target area after the bombing stopped. In those hours, the German survivors would crawl out of their bunkers, set up their machine guns, and call in their own artillery. The corridor of passage would be closed before a single tank could enter it. General Collins was facing a choice between 2 different kinds of catastrophe. He could play it safe and guarantee that the infantry would be slaughtered in the open fields when they finally tried to advance, or he could keep them close to the blast and risk another friendly fire disaster. He insisted that the safety margin remain at 1,400 yards. He knew that the only way to break the trap was to have his men moving into the craters while the dirt was still falling from the sky. He chose the risk of the short bomb over the certainty of tactical failure. This was the command crisis of Operation Cobra. It was not a debate about ethics, but a cold calculation of distance and time. The air commanders eventually relented, but the tension remained absolute. As the sun went down on July 24th, the orders were cut for the following morning. The planes would return, and the bomb run would remain perpendicular. The infantry would remain exactly where they were, sitting in their shallow holes, and knowing that the next day might bring their own destruction. General Collins issued no long speeches. He simply checked his watch and waited for the weather to break. He had placed his bet. Now, move forward to the evening of July 25, 1944. The mood at the Corps headquarters was closer to a wake than a victory celebration. The smoke from the second day of bombing was still drifting across the fields, but the radio reports coming back from the front were catastrophic. The airstrike intended to shatter the enemy had instead devastated the American forces for the second time in 24 hours. 111 men were dead from friendly fire, and nearly 500 more were wounded. The infantry commanders were reporting that their units were unable to move. The ground ahead was so choked with bomb craters that the tanks were bottoming out in the loose soil. On paper, the operation was a failure, The infantry had advanced only a few hundred yards. The carpet of bombs had not produced a clean hole, but a junkyard of pulverized trees and dead livestock. Most of the junior officers on the ground were calling for a halt, convinced they were facing another stalemate. But while the American side was struggling with the horror of their own ordnance, a different kind of collapse was happening across the line. To see it, we must look inside a German bunker near the Marigny Road. Colonel Choltitz was stabbing a red pencil into his map, marking the places where his units used to be. As the commander of the sector, he realized that the heavy bombers had done something more profound than just killing soldiers. They had unzipped his entire defensive system. His primary mobile force, the Panzer Lehr, had been the pride of the sector. Now he described them as nothing more than dust and ghosts. Choltitz tried to send frantic warnings to his superiors, but the communication lines had been physically vaporized by the bombardment. He was looking at a map of a gap that was now 5 miles wide, and he had no reserves to plug it. In his mind, the war in the West was ending in that room. He could see the gap was wide open, but he was shouting into a dead telephone. Back at the American command post, General Collins was looking for a sign. He was a man who trusted his intuition for the tempo of a battle. He noticed a detail that most of his staff ignored. The Germans were not counterattacking. In the past, every time the Americans took a single field, the enemy would hit back within the hour. On the evening of the 25th, there was only silence. This was the green light he had been waiting for. He realized that while his own men were dazed, the enemy was paralyzed. He made the decision to ignore the grim reports from the infantry and order the armor to move. This was the pivot point of the entire campaign. He was not going to wait for the infantry to clear the craters. He ordered the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions to drive straight through their own lines and into the unknown. He told his staff that they were going to bust it wide open regardless of the casualties. The breakout did not happen because the bombing was perfect. It happened because one man recognized that a shattered front looks exactly like a stalemate if you do not have the nerve to push through the debris. General Collins gambled that the German 7th Army was a hollow shell, and he was right. As the sun went down, the roar of hundreds of tank engines began to drown out the sound of the artillery. The crews moved into a landscape that resembled the surface of the moon, navigating by the light of burning farmhouses. They were no longer fighting for individual hedgerows. They were racing for the open country beyond the hills. The transition from a slow war of attrition to a rapid war of movement had begun in the dark. The front line had simply vanished. By the morning of July 26, 1944, the corridor of passage was a landscape of craters and pulverized timber. To the men of the armored divisions waiting to move, the view was paralyzing. This was the moment where the entire operation could have stalled, reverting to the cautious habits that had defined the last 2 months. The ground was so churned by 5,000 tons of explosives that the heavy Sherman tanks were bottoming out. Their bellies caught on the lips of bomb craters while their tracks spun uselessly in the loose grey dust. To understand why the breakthrough did not die in those first few hours, you have to look at the change in how the Americans were talking to each other. For 80 days, the air and the ground had been 2 different armies. Now, they were a single machine. Lieutenant Barker was standing in the turret of his lead tank, near a steep ravine that had just swallowed the momentum of his platoon. In front of him, the road had been erased. On the far side of the ravine, hidden in the dense greenery of an orchard that had somehow survived the bombing, a German 8.8mm gun was systematically picking off the lead vehicles. In June, this would have meant a 6-hour delay while the infantry crawled through the ditches to find the flank. But Barker was not calling for infantry. He was white-knuckling the handset of a new radio, talking directly to a pilot in a P-47 Thunderbolt circling 3,000 feet above. He did not use map coordinates. He told the pilot to look for the red smoke he was about to lob into the trees. Seconds later, the fighter bomber tipped its nose down. The roar of its engine drowned out the rattle of machine gun fire as it dropped 2 500-pound bombs directly onto the hidden gun. The armored point was no longer just a target. It had become a sensor. Barker watched as the obstacle that would have stopped a battalion for a day was evaporated in 90 seconds. He ordered his driver to find a path through the debris, and the column kept moving. This was the transition from a methodical advance to a high-velocity pursuit. As the American armor pushed through the Marigny Gap, the German 7th Army began to experience a systemic nervous breakdown. Field Marshal von Kluge was at his headquarters, receiving reports that were no longer about front lines, but about islands of survivors. He realized that his elite mobile reserve had been reduced to a collection of isolated squads wandering through the woods. The unzipping of the front was so total that the orders of the high command were reaching units that no longer existed. Kluge famously told his staff that if no miracle occurred, they would simply have to die like men. But the German soldier remained a lethal professional, even in a rout. As the sun went down on July 26th, the battle shifted from a coordinated defense into a series of savage collisions in the dark. The Americans were moving so fast, they were frequently bypassing German units that had not yet realized they were surrounded. Sergeant Kowalski was positioned at a critical crossroads south of the main advance, bracing his shoulder against the mount of a 50-caliber machine gun. He was part of a small security detail meant to keep the supply road open, but the Norman mist was so thick he could not see 20 yards. Suddenly the silence was broken by the clatter of hobnailed boots and the grinding of truck engines. A disorganized column of German paratroopers and horse-drawn wagons, trying to escape the closing American trap, had blundered directly into his position. Kowalski did not wait for orders. He opened fire, the heavy rounds shredding the lead wagon and pinning the entire column against a stone wall. For the next 3 hours, he held that crossroads alone. The flashes of his gun illuminated a landscape of retreating men who were too exhausted to fight and too terrified to stop. This was not the clean surgical breakthrough described in the newspapers back home. It was a brawl. By the time the sun rose, the crossroads was a graveyard of abandoned equipment. The German counter-thrust had evaporated into the woods. General Collins, watching the reports come in, recognized that the enemy's spine had finally snapped. He was not looking at square miles anymore. He was looking at the disintegration of an army's will to hold a line. The German Seventh Army was no longer a shield. It was a collection of fragments being pushed aside by a mechanized engine that refused to slow down. The tactical reliance on the armored point and the direct link to the sky had turned the impenetrable bocage into a sieve. The pursuit had begun. The calendar had turned to August, and the nature of the war was changing. The high-speed chase toward the base of the peninsula was underway, but the enemy was still capable of producing localized nightmares. By the morning of August 1st, the fog had returned, thick and grey, clinging to the valleys of the Vire. This created a specific problem for the mechanized advance. The pursuit was being slowed by a handful of hidden anti-tank guns that could fire and vanish before the lead vehicles even saw the flash. To solve this, the units adopted a formation they called the tank point. At the very front, they placed a single light tank. Behind it, at a distance, were 2 medium tanks, and trailing those were the tank destroyers. The light tank was not there to win the fight. It was there to be the target. Driver Miller was the man in the lead vehicle that morning. He eased his light tank into the mist, the engine a low growl that seemed to echo off the invisible hedgerows. He knew exactly what he was. He was a decoy. His job was to draw the attention of a hidden Panther or an 8.8mm gun. If the enemy fired at him, they would reveal their position, and the tank destroyers waiting in the rear would use their superior optics to perform a surgical removal. Miller was driving a thin-skinned box into a fog bank, waiting for a high-velocity shell to find him so his friends could finish the job. That morning, a hidden gun did fire. The shell whistled past the turret, striking a stone wall. Because the enemy had taken the bait, the tank destroyers were able to pinpoint the muzzle flash. They fired 3 rounds of armor-piercing shot, and the obstacle was gone. Miller did not stop to celebrate. He simply shifted gears and kept moving into the grey. This was the scalpel approach to the breakout. It was a realization that the sledgehammer of the heavy bombers had done its job, and the remaining resistance had to be picked apart piece by piece. But while some sectors felt like a chase, others remained a grueling struggle. To see this, we must look at the town of Trois-Gêts. This was not a blitzkrieg collapse, but a street fight. Captain Sterling was in the middle of it, frantically prying at a jammed hot shell casing with a screwdriver as his tank sat exposed on a narrow street. The enemy was close enough to throw grenades from the second-story windows. Sterling ignored the fire, focused entirely on the stubborn brass of the shell. He finally cleared the breach, and the gun spoke again. Captain Sterling was in the middle of a street fight that had no grand strategy. He was not looking at a map of France, but at the narrow confines of a village where every cellar held a rifle. Inside his Sherman tank, the air was thick with the smell of burnt powder and hot oil. The vehicle had taken a hit that failed to penetrate, but the shock of the impact jammed a brass shell casing into the breach. His primary weapon was useless. Sterling used a screwdriver to pry at the hot metal, his knuckles bleeding as he fought the mechanism. He knew that the fight for Traugott depended on getting that gun back into action before a German anti-tank team found his turret. He eventually cleared the breach, and the gun spoke again, suppressing the machine gun nests that were pinning down the infantry. This was the granular reality of the breakout. Even as the German command structure collapsed, the individual soldier was still fighting for his life at a single crossroads. Field Marshal von Kluge realized his position was no longer tenable. His communication lines were shattered, leaving him to send orders by bicycle to divisions that had already been erased from his maps. He watched as the American forces unzipped the western coast of the peninsula, opening the way toward the plains of Brittany. The cage of the earthen embankments had been shattered. The War of the Hedgerows was ending. What lay ahead was a race against time to trap the enemy before they could escape across the Seine. The sluggers' match was over. Now, we return to that vibrating earth where we first met Private Outlaw. He was still in his shallow foxhole, but the ground was no longer shaking from the impact of heavy bombs. It was the rhythmic, heavy grinding of steel tracks that made the soil dance. A column of the 2nd Armored Division was racing past his position, a line of vehicles that stretched back to the horizon. The cage had been kicked open. How did the Americans break the trap of the Normandy hedgerows? The answer was not found in a single master plan or a specific bombing coordinate. It was found in the moment the American soldiers stopped looking at the next ditch and started looking at the open road. For 80 days, the army had measured progress in yards. By the final days of July, that army had become a mechanized engine that realized the German defense was no longer a wall, but a series of panicked islands. They broke the trap by realizing they no longer had to fight the hedgerows, they just had to outrun them. This shift created a landscape of lethal confusion. Artilleryman Vance was in a rear area bivouac, miles behind what he thought was the fighting line. He dropped his tin mug of coffee in shock as a column of lost German Tiger tanks rumbled past his tents. The front had dissolved so completely that the rear had become a thoroughfare for a retreating enemy. These German crews were not attacking. They were fleeing in blind desperation. The hunters and the hunted were now sharing the same narrow roads. To see the final moments of the German 7th Army, one must look at the Roncy pocket. 500 vehicles, from half-tracks to horse-drawn wagons, were jammed bumper to bumper on a single road. They were pinned against the ancient stone walls of the bocage. They were not destroyed by a grand maneuver, but by 6 hours of continuous airstrikes and artillery fire. The American speed had slammed the door before the German command could even authorize a retreat. 350 charred hulks of steel and wood were all that remained of the elite units that had held the line. For the men who survived the green hell of the summer, the claustrophobia was replaced by a dizzying sense of scale. The American force was no longer looking at the next embankment. They were looking at the open heart of France. Private Reed sat on the fender of a moving truck, finally peeling off the rotted, wet socks he had worn since the middle of July. As the column raced toward Avranches, he did not look at the maps or the road to Paris. He simply stared at the open horizon, seeing more than 50 yards in front of him for the first time in 2 months. He pulled on a dry pair of socks and watched the hedgerows vanish in the dust. If your father or grandfather served in an armored division or an infantry regiment during the breakout from Normandy, I would be honored to read his story in the comments below. The unit he belonged to, the towns he saw, and the small details of his service are the actual record of those days in France. It is important that these personal histories are preserved by the families who carry them. Thank you for watching, and I hope you will join us for more stories from the front lines.